you so much for the introduction, Maria. Just want to say, first of all, it's a real pleasure and an honour to be here at the LSE, which is a place I came to know very well during researching this book. As Maria said, I spent probably a couple of years altogether in the Women's Library, in the LSE Library around the corner, looking through Jack's incredible archive, Vera Holme, known as Jack, her archive. And so I just want to really, pay tribute to the staff of the Women's Library for all their help and support during that time, especially to Gillian Murphy, the curator, who was extremely helpful. And especially because I did a lot of that early research during lockdown. So that was particularly difficult because the library was only open for a few hours at a time. So without any more ado, I want to start. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I'm very happy to answer any questions, and I'll be even happier to sell you a copy of my book afterwards at a special discount. So please don't let me have to take them all home. So I think today we're all familiar with scenes of war on our screens. And most of us are familiar too with scenes of the First World War, scenes of men stumbling in the mud, men sheltering from bombardment, men injured and dying. So it's easy to forget that there were women in those scenes too, women who risked their lives to help save those who were fighting. This will work. Am I pointing it in the right direction? Just give me a minute. Yeah, all right. Scenes of women helping. So Vera Holme and Evelina Haverfield, who are known to each other as Jack and Eve, were two such women. In the First World War, they worked in Serbia, Russia, and Romania, rescuing sick and injured men, our allies, from the battlefield. Eve ran field hospitals under canvas and commanded all female ambulance crews. And Jack drove ambulances and heavy lorries, ferrying the wounded from the front line to hospitals run by women. So just like the men who volunteered for the trenches, they had no idea what they would find when they volunteered in the first place. What they found, in Romania in particular, was a sea of mud, crisscrossed by potholed tracks, surrounded with streaming with horse-drawn gun carriages, bedraggled troops and wounded men being stretchered from the battlefield. All day long, they transported men who were groaning with shattered limbs, screaming with head injuries, dying from internal wounds, as shells burst all around them. The Allied armies in Romania had only horse-drawn ambulances, so those women were driving the only motorised ambulances at that front. As you can imagine, it was dangerous, exhausting, terrifying work. But Jack and Eve were in their element. They were in the thick of the action, living on their wits. They were, moreover, in love. Virtually inseparable since they first met in the suffragette movement in 1908, they were driven by patriotic duty and mutual devotion. War gave them a chance to prove that they were equal to men, to carve out new paths and new identities, not just for themselves, but for all women. But it would also test their love to the limits. Jack and Eve were born into a Victorian age when women were chiefly regarded as inferior beings to men. Hard to believe nowadays, I know. Eve, who was originally titled the Honourable Lady Evelina Scarlett, was a daughter of an English baron, Lord Abinger, who was a British Army officer, and an American mother who had made their home in Scotland. Born in 1867, she grew up in a world of immense privilege and unusual liberty. The family divided their time between their Scottish home, Inverlochy Castle, and their London townhouse in Kensington. Eve was a brilliant linguist, a skilled horsewoman, and a match for any man at hunting, hiking, and climbing. But while one of her older sisters went into medicine, Eve chose a more conventional path, at least at first. When she was 19, she married an army officer called Major Henry Wickham Brooke Tunstall Haverfield, a bit of a mouthful, who was more than twice her age. And she had 2 sons in quick succession. And here we have Eve and the Major, and Eve with her 2 sons. When the Major died just 8 years later, she was distraught. But she didn't shut herself away in grief. Instead, the day after his funeral, she left her sons with her mother and crossed the Atlantic for a 10-month expedition, traveling Mexico and North America. Sometimes she stayed with friends, but often she traveled alone. And during those travels, she learnt to fire a rifle in Mexico. She visited an opium den in San Francisco, where she smoked a pipe, but she insisted it did not have any effect on her. And she shot the rapids on the Canadian River. She did not remain single for long. When she was 32, she married another army officer, Major John Henry Balguy, who was 40, and who was her first husband's best friend. It was really a marriage of convenience, providing a father for her 2 sons and a mother for Balguy's 2 daughters. And on her wedding night, Eve wrote in her diary, "I married Major Henry Balguy, RA, Royal Artillery, with no intention of changing my name or mode of life in any way." And she was true to her word. She enacted a legal document to revert to her first husband's name, and she would remain Eve Haverfield, Evelina Haverfield, all her life. And the couple lived separate lives. So it's no surprise that she was drawn to the campaign for women's votes. At first, Eve joined the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS, the suffragists, who campaigned for the vote through democratic means, but she soon became disillusioned with their lack of progress, and she joined the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, or the suffragettes, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her charismatic daughters. And it was in the heady atmosphere of the suffragette campaign that Eve met Vera Holme. Well, 14 years younger than Eve, Vera was a chorus girl from a middle-class family who was frequently down on her luck. She was born in Southport in Lancashire in 1881, the only daughter of a timber merchant. And like most middle-class girls of the time, she was taught to be prim and demure in expectation of married life. But this ambition had no appeal for Vera. She was happier sailing, swimming, and playing tennis with her younger brother Gordon than fumbling at needlework or struggling with grammar. She was never very good at grammar or spelling, and I can tell you that from reading her diaries. And a spell at a Belgian convent school did nothing to change that outlook. When Vera's father died when she was 13, suddenly the family was thrown onto the charity of aunts and uncles. 5 years later, when her mother married again, Vera was forced to make her own way in the world. There were few respectable choices open to a young single woman with no academic leanings or independent income. And so Vera took to the stage. She was a gifted singer and a violinist, and she had some success in pantomimes and comic opera. But what she most enjoyed was putting on male costume to appear in cross-dressing roles. Publicity shots show her dressed as a sailor, a dandy, and a bellboy. And those are 2 of the fabulous photographs from the Women's Library in the archive. And in one role, she was cast as a character called Jack, and the name stuck. Vera became Jack. On tour with theatre companies, Jack revelled in an independence that was rarely enjoyed by women of the time. She had flirtations with promising young men, but she was far more interested in the young women, fellow actresses and friends in the theatre world, who she invited to her rooms and into her bed. She confided discreet details of these relationships in the diary that she would keep all her life. One excerpt in 1903 recorded, "Rosie got into Aggie's and my bed. Had great fun." The nomadic life was not all fun, however. Jack was often lonely and struggled to make ends meet. Sometimes she had to pawn jewellery or skip meals to get by. The suffragette movement changed Jack's life. She joined the WSPU and was welcomed into the Pankhurst inner circle, with some reservations. Sylvia Pankhurst described her as a noisy, explosive young person, frequently rebuked by her elders for lack of dignity. Well, Jack became a full-time activist in southwest England, where she organised protests and clever publicity stunts. In one escapade in Bristol, she and a fellow suffragette smuggled themselves into a political meeting. And it was a meeting at which women were not allowed for fear that the suffragettes might disrupt it. So they hid themselves before the meeting began in the hall's great organ among the pipes. So the local MP rose up and began his speech by saying, "I am going to tell you about," and then Jack and her friend yelled out, "Votes for women!" But it took the stewards 10 minutes to hunt down the two suffragettes who were hiding in the organ. And then they were promptly thrown into the street. So it was in this daring and intoxicating world that Eve and Jack met and fell in love. In many ways, they were complete opposites. Eve was classically beautiful. Her golden hair and fashionable clothing were always perfectly styled, while Jack had a boyish figure and was most comfortable in men's suits and brogues. Eve's manners were polished and refined, while Jack was loud and gregarious, always ready to use her musical talents to turn any gathering into a party. Yet they were kindred spirits. They were instantly and forever devoted. In the suffragettes, Jack and Eve led processions, and they were at the forefront of violent demonstrations. In 1909, Jack was appointed official chauffeur to Emmeline Pankhurst, so she became one of the first women chauffeurs in Britain and indeed the world. And there's Jack in her wonderful chauffeur's uniform and next to the suffragette car. So in this smart uniform and her peaked cap, she drove Mrs. Pankhurst and other suffragette leaders all over Britain, drawing admiring glances from men and women alike. On her first assignment, she took the Pankhurst on a 1,500-mile tour of Scotland, navigating mountain roads and handling mechanical breakdowns with ease. Her role as a chauffeur gave her the license to dress and behave how she wanted. And Eve was never far from her side. They were also accomplished horsewomen who rode astride, which was unusual for women at the time, as mounted marshals in suffrage parades. Well, as the suffragette protests escalated, Jack and Eve threw themselves into the fray. At one demonstration, Eve slapped a police officer across the face, and she later told the court that next time she would bring a pistol. And few people doubted her ability to carry out that threat. Shortly afterwards, Eve and Jack were arrested for smashing windows, and they both served time in Holloway prison. But away from the violence, Jack and Eve found a tranquil refuge at Eve's house, Peace Cottage, which was near the North Devon coast. They hung curtains in the suffragette colours at the windows, and they slept in a double bed, which Jack carved with both of their initials. So behind the closed doors of Peace Cottage, they could indulge their love to the full. Jack wrote love poems for Eve, which rejoiced in your strong embrace, your caressing arms, kisses on my face, heartbeat on heart. In one poem, she described Eve as her twin soul. And in her diaries, she referred to Eve as baby. As a couple, they socialized with other Bohemian women. Many of them were also lesbians, who saw the suffrage movement as a liberating force, as much as a force for liberation. How they navigated life as two lesbian women in the early 20th century is one of the issues I explore in detail in the book. Well, 6 years after they first met, on the 5th of August, 1914, Jack and Eve woke up to news that Britain was at war with Germany. Well, within a week, the suffragettes suspended all their militant activities and threw their efforts into supporting Britain on the home front. But Jack and Eve were even quicker off the mark. So less than 2 days after the outbreak of war, Eve co-founded with another suffragette, Decima Moore, the Women's Emergency Corps in order to recruit women into typically male jobs, such as drivers, motorcyclists, and interpreters, in order to free up men at the front, for the front. And then a few weeks later, Eve launched the Women's Volunteer Reserve, WVR, which was a form of female home guard, ready to defend Britain in the event of an enemy invasion, which was actually a real possibility in the early days of the war. So the WVR was run along military lines. Its recruits were trained in first aid and signalling and shooting. So Eve had to reassure critics that her women would not take up arms against the enemy without first getting government approval, though she was more than ready to do that herself. Thousands of women flocked to enroll. At one meeting where Eve spoke, 700 women signed up on the spot. And Jack became a major in charge of one of the London battalions. But not content with organising those two organisations, in early 1915, Eve founded the Women's Reserve Ambulance to recruit women ambulance drivers to transport wounded patients between hospitals. And it was the success of those three organisations that later spurred the War Office to launch auxiliary branches for women. So the WACs, the WRENs and the RAFs, who would work alongside men in the services. Well, by this point, in early 1915, Eve's eldest son, John, and Jack's brother, Gordon, had both enlisted for active service. And Jack and Eve were determined that they would play an active role in the war too. So in spring 1915, they joined the Scottish Women's Hospitals, an organisation set up by a Scottish surgeon, Elsie Ingalls, to send all female medical units to war zones overseas. Ingalls, who was 50 when the war broke out, was a quiet dynamo of energy and willpower. As a surgeon with 20 years' experience, she had volunteered her services to the War Office immediately the war was declared. But she had been told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." But far from sitting still, Elsie Ingalls raised funds through the suffrage movement, recruited women doctors, nurses and orderlies, and offered their aid instead to Britain's allies. And the governments of France, Belgium and Serbia welcomed her with open arms. By the end of 1914, the SWH was running a typhoid hospital in Calais, an emergency hospital in northern France, and a third unit had set sail for Serbia. And it was to Serbia that Eve and Jack headed. Well, Serbia, as you'll all know from your history lessons, had been propelled onto the world stage in June 1914 when a 19-year-old Bosnian student assassinated the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo as part of a nationalist campaign to unite Bosnia with Serbia. The Austro-Hungarian Empire used this terrorist act as an excuse to invade Serbia, and Austria's ally, Germany, seized the opportunity to march on France and occupy Belgium en route. And then Serbia took the world by surprise when its mostly peasant army repulsed the Austrian invasion. But Serbia's victory quickly turned to disaster as the thwarted invasion left behind thousands of wounded soldiers and prisoners of war and a typhus epidemic which swept the country. So the first Scottish Women's Hospital unit, which arrived in Serbia in early 1915, battled to treat the sick. But the women were powerless to prevent many thousands dying, including several of their own team. When Elsie Ingalls set out for Serbia in May 1915, she took Eve with her. Despite having no medical or hospital experience, Eve then set up and ran a field hospital completely under canvas. And I think you can see from that picture how much she was enjoying the experience. Jack followed a few weeks later to work as an ambulance driver. By day, they treated Serbian soldiers who were now holding the line against another threatened invasion. And by night, they slept out under the stars with only a mosquito net for cover. Eve, who was never anything less than forthright, clashed with the women doctors who she'd been sent out to support, not once but twice. And she was moved to run another field hospital. And Jack, who got on with everyone, she followed. But their efforts were short-lived. In October 1915, Serbia was invaded again by combined German, Austro-Hungarian and Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian armies. And so Jack and Eve had to join a retreat into central Serbia. Well, most foreign aid workers in Serbia now joined a mass exodus, including the Serbian army and thousands of Serbian refugees going across the Albanian mountains to reach the Adriatic coast. And this was known as the Great Retreat. But Jack and Eve decided to stay behind in central Serbia as the invaders marched closer. When local people panicked and started looting the shops, Eve and Jack defended the Red Cross stores armed with a revolver. And then in November, they became prisoners of war, along with Elsie Ingalls and a small group of other hardy women, and they were held captive, first by the Germans and then by the Austrians for the next 3 months. Well, living in one room in a former ammunition store in the grounds of a military hospital, there are about 20 women in this room, Eve, Jack, and their fellow captives treated thousands of Serbian sick and wounded prisoners in appalling cramped conditions and amid drastic food shortages through a bitterly cold winter. At one point, Jack fell dangerously ill with fever, but Eve nursed her back to health. And then, when it became clear that they were going to be transferred to Austria, Eve, Jack, and one of the women doctors decided that they would hide out in a nearby village. So their plan was to escape to southern Serbia and to try to set up a medical post there for, they believed that troops were there ready to start a new advance. Well, it was a dangerous, really reckless move. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers because hopefully you want to read the book. So I won't tell you how they survived, but suffice to say, they were safely back in England in April 1916. But neither Eve nor Jack was willing to stay idle for long. By now, Eve's son John had been killed in action in the Persian Gulf, and Jack's brother Gordon had been so severely wounded in France that both his legs had to be amputated. And these tragic events made Jack and Eve all the more determined to return to the battlefront. So in August 1916, they joined a new SWH expedition led by Elsie Ingalls to take 75 women to Russia to provide medical support for a division of the Serbian army who were fighting on the Eastern Front. Eve was commander of the 24-strong ambulance unit, and Jack was one of the drivers. So the women were sent via Russia to Romania, to the Dobruja front beside the Black Sea, where Russian, Serbian, and Romanian troops were defending Romania's southern border. Elsie Ingalls ran a base hospital, which was 10 miles from the front line. And that's the hospital. And a second doctor ran a field hospital, which was only a few miles from the battlefield. And that's where the ambulance unit, being run by Eve, was also encamped. Well, immediately they arrived, the ambulances were called out to collect wounded soldiers from dressing stations near the front line. Jack and her fellow ambulance drivers ferried casualties for hours on end. They had to drive their ambulances on rough tracks, which turned into quagmires when it rained, often in the dark, and often under attack from bursting shells and planes which dropped bombs on their tents, despite the Red Crosses. In those conditions, their vehicles regularly broke down or burst tires. One of the drivers had to change a wheel during a bombing raid, while her passengers dived for safety. Things did not go well for the Allies. The combined German, Bulgarian, and Turkish forces steadily advanced. So less than a month after they had arrived, the SWH women had to retreat, not once, but twice, along with the Allied troops and thousands of refugees on chaotic journeys, which they survived only through extraordinary resourcefulness and luck. Eve, Jack, and the other drivers were often the last to flee before the advancing enemy. So they were often at the end of the line. The army was retreating and they had to keep going back to the firing line to collect more casualties. Their vehicles frequently got stuck in mud, or they ran out of petrol, or they broke down completely. So I think it was a miracle they all survived. The stories of their bravery, which are described in detail in my book, are just truly awe-inspiring. By the end of 1916, the Allies had to abandon Romania. So the women retreated back over the border into Russia, now Ukraine. And now they worked for the Russian army, treating the wounded in a hospital they ran in one of the worst winters in living memory. So the women had to scavenge supplies to feed themselves and their patients, and their water had to be melted from snow. By now, tensions had boiled over among the drivers. And this was partly due to Elsie Ingalls' insistence that the women always had to behave with perfect decorum, even though they were doing the same jobs as men in extreme circumstances, to the extent they were not allowed to sit in a cabin with men who were there with the armoured cars. They weren't allowed to sit and share tea with them. But also because of Eve's uncompromising expectations. The transport unit was in full-blooded mutiny, and so Elsie Ingalls really had no choice but to send Eve home early in 1917, while Jack stayed behind. And although they remained devoted throughout the rest of their lives, at this point, 8 years after they'd first met, their relationship had changed. So Jack, who'd always been an incorrigible charmer, began relationships with other women. She became besotted with one of the drivers, one of the women drivers, who she called Peter. And Eve, who of course was still grieving over the death of her son, she grew more distant and aloof. Back in Britain, Eve spent her time raising funds for the SWH and for the Serbian army, who were actually mostly in Macedonia, training for an advance to try to reclaim Serbia. But Jack stayed behind in Russia in increasingly dangerous conditions. The first Russian Revolution in spring 1917 created widespread unrest in the Russian army and triggered suspicions among about their foreign allies. In April, Russian soldiers arrested one of the SWH women and accused her of spying. The confusion was resolved, but suspicions lingered and the tensions mounted. The British government and the Red Cross urged Elsie Ingalls to bring her unit home, but she refused to leave without guarantees that the Serbian troops who they'd come out there to support were guaranteed safe passage out of Russia so they could join the Macedonian front. But her appeals to the British government fell on deaf ears. And so in August 1917, Ingalls decided to send 2 women back to Britain with a coded message outlining in detail the threat facing the Serbian allies. She chose for this mission a driver who was called Francis Robinson and Jack. Well, because it was too dangerous to carry this message actually written out in full, Francis Robinson committed Ingalls' memo to memory. And Jack, and she wrote the headings as an aide memoir on a scrap of paper, which Jack hid in a needle packet in her luggage. So you can imagine the danger of this at the time. The 2 women took nearly 6 weeks to travel back to Britain through Russia. They arrived in London shortly before Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution. And then they presented their message to government ministers. And spurred on by this first-hand information, the War Office now insisted to the Russian allies that the Serbian forces should be allowed to come back to Britain. So the Serbs travelled back to Britain with Elsie Ingalls and the remaining SWH women. But when their ship docked in Newcastle, Elsie Ingalls, who'd kept secret all along the fact that she was suffering from cancer, she took salutes from the Serbian officers on the deck. And the following day, she died. Well, Jack and Eve spent the rest of the war giving lectures on their wartime experiences to raise funds for the SWH and for Eve's Serbian charity. Their paths crossed on occasions, but they mostly led separate lives for now. By October 1918, Jack was living in Edinburgh with a Scottish artist called Dorothy Johnston, who she nicknamed Dodo, in a triangular and sometimes troubled relationship with Dodo's student, Anne Finlay, who was known as Spook. Jack particularly was partial to 3-way relationships. And so Jack was with Dodo when the armistice was declared the following month. Well, Eve had no such inclination to settle down. At the end of 1918, as soon as possible after the war had ended, she headed a Red Cross delegation to take food, clothes, and medical aid to war-ravaged Serbia. And then the following year, she embarked on plans to set up a home for war orphans in a remote region of Western Serbia. As soon as she asked Jack to join her, Jack did not hesitate, despite her newfound happiness with Dodo. The lure of a new adventure and her loyalty to Eve were too strong to keep her back. Yet even though she was thrilled to be working with Eve again, Jack could not resist another fling with a half-Serbian, half-Scottish aid worker who was called Natalia. And the extent to which she felt the need to be discreet about these simultaneous relationships is ambiguous. At a New Year's Eve party to welcome in 1920, Jack danced with Eve, and then when the lights went out at midnight, they kissed. But she lamented in her diary the fact that she could not then bring Natalia home for the night. Well, in early 1920, Jack joined Eve to help run the new orphanage, which had just opened in Bina Bashta, an impoverished village which was a 7-hour mountain trek from the nearest railway station. And at the orphanage, Eve and Jack and a handful of other women looked after 50 children and also provided medical aid to local families. And those are the children with Jack in the middle. But only a few weeks after the orphanage had opened, Eve set out in the snow to act as an interpreter to a local doctor visiting a patient. On her return, she took to her bed with a fever. And then 10 days later, she died of pneumonia. She was just 52 years old. Her last words, which she repeated over and over, were Vera, 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 Jack's original name. Well, Eve was buried in the village, where a street and a medical centre were named after her. So her grave is still in Bajnabashta. That's actually me visiting Bajnabashta with her grave, and at the hospital with the priest who looks after the grave. And she was, and she still is, revered as a war hero in Serbia, even though her name's more or less forgotten here. Her work is celebrated in an annual ceremony in Bajnabashta every autumn. Well, Jack, as you might imagine, was bereft. She had lost, she wrote in her diary, the person she loved most in the world. She stayed on in Serbia for another 18 months to run the orphanage, and then she handed it over to the local people in 1922. Then she returned to Britain and moved to Scotland with two friends and lovers, Margaret Kerr and Margaret Greenlees, who'd both worked with her at the orphanage. And those are the two Margarets with Jack and another friend. And the three women lived together in Loch Ernhead in the Scottish Highlands, where they became known as the ladies of Loch Ernhead. Until Kerr moved out in 1939. It's not quite clear why. And they lived on, Jack and Margaret Greenlees lived on there until 1952, when Greenlees sadly died. And after that, Jack lived on alone. But she never forgot Eve, who was her first and her deepest love. So nearly 50 years after Eve's death, Jack broke down in tears when she was talking about Eve. Well, Jack died at the age of 87 in a nursing home in Glasgow on the 1st of January, 1969. So she'd been born in Edwardian times, Victorian times. She'd lived through Edwardian times and also survived the swinging 60s. Quite incredible. Well, together, Eve and Jack carved radical new paths which paved the way for modern women. They believed and they demonstrated that women could do anything that men could do, whether that was driving ambulances, running military hospitals, or shouldering a gun. They refused to compromise in their sexuality too. They were devoted to each other, lifelong partners, even though Jack, at least, enjoyed relationships with other women. Their determination to be themselves, forthright, flamboyant, and proud, is, I think, an inspiration still to us all. So I've just given a whistle-stop summary of the story. I can assure you there's lots more adventures and twists and turns and historical and social context in the book. But I'm very happy to answer any questions now. So thank you.